I want to cover two things today, two topics, I should say. One is edges. And for those of you who joined my Patreon virtual event last month, we talked about these. So there's going to be some redundant information there, but it's also good practice because good edge control really doesn't ever not be important with watercolors. So we'll talk about edges and then talk about water and painting water. And if I'm not too clever for my own britches, we might even be able to talk about edges within water. That's the intent. Because I know water is a topic that a lot of people are interested in, and I think can feel very confusing as a topic. But I think if we apply the lens of thinking about water from an edge standpoint, my hope is that it's going to be a little bit more straightforward. How does that sound? Show thumbs? I got a couple thumbs up. Cool. All right, here is a pop quiz for those of you who did join a month ago. What are the three types of edges that I tend to think about in watercolor? Number one, who can throw out one?
Hard edge.
Hard edge, that's one. Yep, what's the second one?
Soft edge.
Soft edge. Brittany was paying attention. What's the third one?
No edge. Lost.
Nope, that's soft.
Lost.
That's
Found
soft.
edge? What's
Broken.
found edge?
A broken edge. Found edge is a hard edge.
Broken. Okay.
Yeah. So I tend to think of it as one of three types of edges, and I've got like a little visual here, right? There's hard edges, there's soft edges, and then there's broken edges. If you would like to paint along with me, you are more than welcome to. I would strongly suggest using paper with some tooth because it's really hard to do broken edge on hot press paper. But edges, I think it may be sort of straightforward, but edges are ultimately the lines that we use between things in a painting. I know that maybe seems stupid to kind of start there, but they are there to help us guide viewers on where to look or not to look. And they're one of the best ways that we have, I think, to do that and to create interest in our paintings. So like you all came up with, I think of watercolor, and you'll hear them talked about in lots of different ways, but I think of watercolor in one of three types of edges. Anytime you're putting something down, you ultimately have the choice of three different edges around it. You have hard edges, which I'm going to go into each of these in more depth. You have the soft edges, and you have broken edges. They go by different names. You'll hear people talking about them in different ways. Hard edges are sometimes called found edges. Soft edges are sometimes called lost edges. And broken edges are sometimes called scumbling. I've heard that phrase used to describe it, or scumbled. I call them broken edges. But those are the three types of edges. So I'm just going to do like a real quick overview of each of those. But we can also practice them while we are doing it. So pick any color that you want. You can pick any color. There is no wrong answer here because we are just doing an exercise. I am going to use this coral to demonstrate because it's a nice bright color. It's cheerful. I think it's a lovely little color, and it should show up pretty well for you all on the video. You can see this, yes? Successfully? Okay, cool. All right, so a hard edge defines and separates spaces and shapes. It creates contrast, high contrast, and it draws attention because of that contrast and because of the definition between them. It's easiest to make this, and I have a handy little chart that I'm going by here that I made, in case you're wondering why I keep looking over here. It's easiest to make with some form of wet paper, and there are varying degrees of wet that you can do here, right? You know, depending on how loaded with pigment your brush is. But it's easiest to do on wet paper, wet paint on dry paper. I need a little bit more water. So I'm just going to create a positive shape here real fast. And everywhere around this shape that I'm creating right here, every one of these four edges is ultimately a hard edge. I've taken wet paint and applied it to dry paper. And so there's a clear definition between the area where there is paint and the area where there is not on all four sides. So that's a shape with hard edges. In this case, four hard edges, but you could also make a circle and then it's a shape with one hard edge. Doesn't really matter. Whatever shape you're talking about, A hard edge has lots of contrast and lots of definition between it and things that are not it. These are found edges. These are clearly identifiable edges that you can look at, point to, stick your finger on, whatever. When we're painting, usually in a scene, hard edges come from strong light, right? Because they're going to create some kind of a contrast. So if there's more diffuse light, you tend to get fewer hard edges. But they're really useful for making attention. So hard edges, good for making positive shapes. They are done with some level of wet paper or wet paint on dry paper. They are harder to do if your paper has any moisture to it. Not impossible. You can do it with damp paper. So I'm intentionally using dirty water here, so hopefully you can see my shape and paper towel. So I just put a little bit of water down. I am now blotting it up and trying to create a damp, so my paper is damp at this point. And you can make a fairly hard edge even within damp paper. Maybe not as hard of an edge as here, but a fairly hard edge with damp paper. When your paper gets wet, basically impossible to do a hard edge. So you can see here, there's a little bit, maybe you can't, but there's a little bit of fuzziness where I'm losing that edge, but for the most part, it's a pretty hard edge. Cool. So that's hard edges. I'm going to skip broken edges and come back to it because in my mind, they're kind of in the middle of the two. Broken edges are. So let's do soft edges. Soft edges merge objects. So if hard edges define them and separate them, soft edges merge objects and spaces, and they obscure separations. They don't create separation, they obscure it. So in general, because of this, they create less contrast. They're low contrast areas. They don't attract attention, they deter it. They make it so it's easier for your eye to slide off of that space. And they're basically built by using water, right? To essentially disperse the pigment and gradiate it out. So let me start with a hard edge. You know what? I want to use a different color. I'm going to use yellow. Tell me if you can't see this, or maybe I'll mix them. I'll make a nice orange. There we go. That'll work. Cool. All right. So I'm going to create a positive shape here real quickly. And right now, this positive shape has essentially 4 hard edges. If we want to make any of those edges soft, or all of those edges soft, all we need to do is take the wet paint and dry paper that it's on and change the composition of the dry paper. And that's going to make it so that the paint disperses out into it. So I'm just taking clean water, I'm putting it next to, but not directly on my shape, and then I'm bringing my brush over and touching the edge of it. And instantly that edge starts to disappear. It starts to soften. And again, we can do that on all 4 sides if we want. The softer the edge comes from how far out you disperse that same amount of pigment. And it also depends on how much pigment you're trying to disperse, right? So if I want, I could take this all the way out to clear water, basically. Right, and that edge just, this is why they're called lost edges. That edge just kind of disappears and gradiates out. Very different from a hard edge.
Do you have to do it while the paint's wet? I went back to the first block and it's not.
Yeah,
Okay.
It is easiest to do. It is easiest to do while the paint is wet. Yes. It's not impossible to do. So up here, these shapes at this point are pretty close to dry. You can soften an edge. So I've just taken clean water into my brush, and I'm going up and I'm just lightly rubbing it against this hard edge right here.
Okay, so you run it right onto it. Okay.
Yep, right onto it. And then I'm bringing it down and kind of bringing it up in. You want to make sure that it's totally dry here, otherwise it'll create cauliflowers. And if you don't want that, then don't do that. But you can soften a hard edge, especially if you're using good 100% cotton watercolor paper. This is one of the reasons I advocate for it, not just because I have bougie tastes, which I don't. But yeah, you can soften an existing hard edge, right? Just by going in and disrupting those paint pigment particles, because that's really what you're doing, is you're just picking some of that pigment up and then spreading out where it ends. So you can take a hard edge and make it softer.
Okay.
I don't think you're gonna.
Could I feel like that I'm not gonna. I would look at a painting later and decide I don't like that edge. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
a very common thing for me to go in and edit, to see a painting and be like, I don't quite like that. I'm going to go soften this. Or maybe an area is too soft, right? Maybe this feels too soft to me and I want to make it harder. I would have to wait for it to dry because, again, it's hard to make a hard edge on wet paper. But if I waited for it to dry, then you can go in and you can create a hard edge after it's dried,
Okay.
right? So you can layer these on top of one another pretty easily, as long as you don't sit there fiddling with it too much, because that's where you'll disrupt the paint that's under it. But you can see even here, which is still a little bit damp, I was able to create a bit of a hard edge. So you got soft edges, you got hard edges.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that's worth noting is a soft edge doesn't have to just be to clean water, right? You can create a soft edge between two color fields as well. So here I'm using orange, and then I'll make a yellow, and I've created a soft edge between those. Compare that to a field of orange. If I want to create a hard edge between that and a yellow, I need to leave a little bit of space, or I need to let it dry. Because as soon as those two wet fields hit one another, they're going to merge and it's going to soften. So I actually touched it right there, so it's starting to merge. But the only other way to do it while this is still wet is to create just a little bit of space. Let me see if I can do it on the top instead. You leave just a little bit of white between them, and you'll be able to create hard edges between those two color fields, as opposed to this. So whether you're softening an edge or you're merging two soft edges, either way, it's really about leveraging water to create blends. And one of the comments that somebody in the Facebook group made was like, how do I make those kind of like dreamy effects? A lot of the dreamy effect is just controlling your colors and shapes and subject matter, the things that you paint within wet and wet, right? So taking a wet field and then taking perhaps a slightly stronger pigment paint with less water, so it's not going to bloom on you with a cauliflower, and creating your marks in it, right? And so if I get more water, it's going to move more. So it's really just the control of how much pigment to water there is, both on the paper and in your brush. Same thing over here. So there's a lot of water here. That's why these brush strokes that I've just made are moving a lot more. Whereas here, they're staying put a little bit more because this is starting to dry a bit. So if you want to make those dreamy effects, you have to work basically wet on wet. Because when you work wet on dry, you create hard edges, and that's sort of the opposite of dreamy and kind of ethereal. Cool. So we've covered hard edges, we've covered soft edges. The last one, the third one, is broken edges. And you actually saw me wrestling with not making broken edges because I love them so very, very much. My natural inclination is to break the edges. It's also the reason I love paper with texture on it. If a hard edge defines a shape and separates spaces and shapes, and a soft edge merges objects and spaces and obscures the separation, a broken edge is somewhere in between them. So ultimately, a broken edge, in my mind, is a bunch of tiny hard edges. You're creating a bunch of tiny circles or shapes using the texture of the paper. So I'm going to make a hard edge here, or excuse me, a broken edge right along here. That's a broken edge. And if you compare that to, if you compare the right side where it's broken with the left side where it's a hard edge, you can see that there's a clear difference. And then I'll soften this edge. So this shape has all three edges baked in. You've got a soft edge down here where the water gradiates it. You got a hard edge over here, and then you've got broken edges over here. But if you really look at that broken edge, it's a bunch of little positive shapes mixed with negative shapes. And that's where the texture of the paper, which is bumpy, when you scumble your brush across the top of it, you're only hitting the peaks. Let's pretend that my knuckles are the peaks of the paper texture. You're only hitting the peaks, And then the valleys of that don't get paint in them, and they remain whatever color is there already. So in this case, it's white because there was nothing there. But I could take the same color and I could do a broken edge over my existing shape, right? And the valley is going to be this coral color that was already there.
All right. It almost looks like you need to do that with a dry brush to have that broken
you can
edge.
to break the paint. It's easiest with a dry brush or a mostly dry brush, but you have to have enough paint and liquid on your brush to be able to actually apply stuff. So if you just went straight, like if you just had straight tube paint on there, it's, yeah, you can get a lot of breakage, right? But I'm interested in the edge, right? Not necessarily the rest of the shape. And sometimes you don't want the whole shape to be broken. Sometimes you just want the edge, right? To control that. The biggest thing for breaking an edge is less the amount of paint that's on your brush, although certainly removing a lot of the paint and moisture can help. The biggest thing is actually where you apply the pressure on the brush. So if you look at the brush, you've got the tip of the brush here, you have the belly right here, that's where it stores most of the water. The tip is, the finest point. And this is true regardless of what brush type we're talking about. This is a round, but it's equally true if it's a flat or dagger or striper or whatever. It doesn't matter. You're going to have some sort of a tip. You're going to have some sort of a belly. You're going to have the ferrule, which is the metal piece that holds your brush hairs. And then, of course, you have the handle of the brush. And the way that you get broken edges, let me reload this real quick. The way that you get it is you put all of your pressure, and I'm not applying a ton of pressure here, but you put your pressure on the ferrule so that the paper, when you put your, you can see that against my finger, right? When you put your brush down, you're rubbing the belly against the paper, and the tip of the brush is actually where it breaks because there's no pressure pushing down on it. Let me do that with paper instead of my finger. I'm putting it down. You can see that. And then I'm dragging it towards. And all the pressure is right here on the ferrule and on the belly. And so the tip is where it breaks the most because there's no pressure. And it's also where it carries the least amount of water because most of the water is in the belly. So how you apply a brush stroke can have as big of an impact on the type of edge that you make as anything. For example, if I want to make a hard edge, I can take my brush and use the tip and create a very clean, hard edge. If I want to soften that, I would probably also I'm just using clear water here, but I would soften it also with the tip. I'm just kind of rubbing the tip along the edge of it, and that softens it. So it's drawing all the water out of the belly of my brush as I apply pressure, and it's softening that left-hand edge. Broken, I'm putting all my pressure down on this. So there's going to be the most amount of paint right there where I put my brush down, but as I drag down, there's no pressure here on the brush anymore, and so it starts to break. And yes, to Donna's point, one of the ways that you can force that is just take a lot of the moisture out, and it will break. It will break easier. The other thing that's interesting about broken edges to me, let me just talk very quickly about them. So if high contrast hard edges draw attention and soft edges lose attention, I mean, it's hard to pay attention to this edge right here because it just sort of disappears, right? Compare your eye's ability to draw itself to here or here versus right there, or anything in this shape, except maybe this. So soft edges are there to deter attention. Broken edges modulate attention, right? And especially, I'm breaking these things apart, but it's really, really useful to use them together with one another or in conjunction with one another.